I want to bring in Nile Gardiner, also in London. He was a foreign policy researcher for former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Nile, good to see you, as always. President Trump has been a disruptor of NATO since taking office, as he promised he would be. You have said that President Trump was a wake-up call for a complacent alliance. Do you think he's ever gone too far?
Well, I think that, President Trump's leadership of the NATO alliance has actually been very effective. If you look at overall levels of defense spending among all NATO partners, they have significantly increased, actually, over the past 3 years. And even the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, has been effusive in his praise, actually, of President Trump's leadership of the NATO alliance. So I'd say you have to really look at the big picture here. There are more U.S. troops on the ground now than there were under President Obama. You've got a far bigger U.S. presence now in Eastern Europe. And I think that President Trump's pressure certainly has significantly increased the willingness of NATO allies to spend more on defense. Of course, a lot more needs to be done on that front, but we are making progress. And I would argue that Trump's no-nonsense approach has actually been overall pretty effective in raising the level of pressure on NATO partners. It's also important to point out that many U.S. presidents have appealed for increased defense spending by NATO allies. I think only President Trump has really been successful in delivering that.
Well, it started, I think, in 2014 with Obama getting them to pledge 2% of GDP on defense budgets. But no question, in the last 3 years, that number has gone up significantly, and President Trump has been really pressing the case. I want to ask you, the Trump administration has announced they want to cut the contribution from the U.S. to NATO from 22% down to about 16%. What do you make of that?
Well, so that is actually basically a central, fund for NATO management and operations. The big picture really is overall levels of defense spending as a percentage of GDP by member states. And the United States spends about 3.42% of GDP on defense. The Germans spend 1.36% of GDP. There's a huge gulf there. And so President Trump has made an appeal for every single NATO partner to invest more in their defense and contribute more to overall military operations. And so far, you've seen many European countries failing, actually, to meet the minimum 2% agreed percentage of GDP on defense. And I think that Trump's overall approach is to say to European allies, look, everyone has to basically bear the burden of NATO defense spending. And I think this is the right message to send. Every single NATO partner has to roll up their sleeves and invest what is necessary in order to sustain the alliance for another 70 years.
So now, one of the reasons that French President Macron recently called NATO brain dead in that interview with The Economist in October was, quote, you have no coordination whatsoever of strategic decision-making between the United States and its NATO allies, none. You have an uncoordinated aggressive action by another NATO ally, Turkey, in an area where our interests are at stake. There's been no NATO planning nor any coordination, unquote. Macron clearly saying that President Trump's actions have been undermining this vital alliance. I know that there are a number of other leaders in NATO who disagree with the idea that it's brain dead. But do you have any issues with the way that President Trump's coordination with NATO allies has fallen short in Macron's view?
Well, I have to say, actually, that Emmanuel Macron's position and stance at the moment is the single biggest threat to the future of the NATO alliance. Macron declared recently that Russia should no longer be viewed as the enemy of NATO. He's called the NATO alliance brain dead. Emmanuel Macron supports building a European Union army to challenge not only the Russians and the Chinese, but also the United States as well. And President Trump rightly described that as an insulting approach. And the French also spend just 1.86% of GDP on defense. They're not meeting the minimum 2% agreed spending level. And Emmanuel Macron's role, I think, has been deeply unhelpful. And I think that, Monsieur Macron is significantly undermining the NATO alliance at a critically important time. His remarks have been condemned by many European allies, including by Angela Merkel. The German Chancellor has taken Mr. Macron to task for his comments. So Emmanuel Macron needs to do more, actually, to strengthen the NATO alliance rather than undermine it.
All right, Nile Gardiner, thank you so much for your time. It's good to see you, as always.